Hey guys, recently I purchased this keyboard off of Amazon. It's a mechanical keyboard made by a company called Velocifire. It's 10 keyless, so it's nice and small, fits on my desk. And the real reason I got it was just because I needed an extra keyboard to use on my second computer, my laptop. However, I realized that this keyboard was actually way more quality than I thought. It only comes in for $40 on Amazon, but it has a very heavy feeling to it. It feels super quality, and the case looks super nice. It has really low sitting keys, so it gets hidden by the case, so you don't see those exposed switches, which is something I don't like. And the keyboard also has very clean font and a super clean layout. No crazy RGB, nothing like that. So it just looks super clean and super high quality. So that's when I thought, maybe I can turn this keyboard into something a little bit better and invest some money and time into it. Here's a sound test of what the keyboard sounds like before I did anything to it. So this keyboard comes with Otemu Browns. I think I'm saying that right. But they're a tactile switch. They're not some super cheap switch like I thought they were going to be, some cherry knockoff. I think these switches come in for like 30 cents a switch, which is comparable to like Gatorons and other switches that you see in a lot of, higher end keyboards. They are by no means the best switch I've ever felt or heard, but they do feel tactile. I do feel the bump, but as you can hear, the keyboard is a little bit rattly, and a lot of the stabilizers definitely are not lubed. So that's why I needed to switch out to Kailh Blacks. So if you want to replace your switches, you're obviously going to need a couple tools. One, you're definitely going to need a screwdriver, and definitely have a switch puller and a keycap puller. So I'm specifically using Kailh Box Blacks because, one, I wanted a linear switch so that this keyboard could be a little bit more silent. I didn't want it to be too loud. And I also heard that with box switches, you don't need to lube them. They're self-cleaning. And in fact, lubing them can be a little bit harder because you'll have to keep continuously lubing them. So it's just better not to lube them. And especially with this keyboard where I'm going to have to desolder every single switch, I did not want to go through the process of also lubing every switch that I was going to put on here. Right now, I'm just taking off every single keycap because I need to be able to access the screws on the plate so that I can take apart the case. And since I'm switching out the switches, I might as well just take every single keycap off. If you wanted to just get to the plate, you only have to take off a couple keycaps. Well, not a couple, maybe like 14 or something. I don't know how many. But way less than the entire keyboard, so that you could just unscrew every screw on the plate. These keycaps are also double shot, which is way higher quality than I would think for a keyboard that was this cheap. So that was a nice surprise. Now, right here is where I started developing this technique, where I would stick 2 fingers in between the keycap puller, and it would allow me to push down on the keycap and so I could stabilize the keycap as I'm pulling it up and allow me to just very easily pull the keycap out. I don't know if anybody's done this before, but it's kind of revolutionary. So there we go, all the keycaps are off. This was definitely one of the easiest parts of this entire process, maybe the easiest part, just taking the keycaps off. So now we can get to all the screws, and even with all the keycaps off, this thing is still pretty heavy, and we're about to see what the plate is made of. Now, since we're going to be soldering, it's always good to have a heat-resistive silicone pad. I don't want to ruin this nice mat that I already have on my table, or whatever your table is made out of. You want to make sure everything's protected. This silicone mat also comes with places to put all the screws that I just took out, which is super nice. Another nice thing about this keyboard is the rubber feet that come on it. It comes with super thick rubber, and as you'll see when I open up the feet, the rubber is all over the plastic. It's not just a thin piece right on the bottom, it's a nice thick rubber feet. Or foot, I guess. So this whole part is just me failing at trying to pry open this board. It's actually a really nice idea to use a guitar pick, especially if you have one laying around. Make sure it's a thin one though. You don't want one that's too thick. That might break your case, damage it, or even break your guitar pick and leave it inside the case. Now, the problem that I ran into here was I forgot about 2 screws on the back. This is playing at like 700% speed, and the entire time I have absolutely no idea why this thing is not coming apart. I even bring in a thicker guitar pick to start prying it apart a little bit more, and yeah, for the life of me, I can't get it open. But there we go, eventually I find them. Those annoying feet. You take them off, you find the screws underneath. I already took off the screws before I recorded this, so I'm not even unscrewing anything. I'm just trying to show you guys, where the screws are. So finally, after those screws are gone, we can finally pry this thing open. And once we get the back of this case open, we can see the beautiful PCB and the plate underneath. But of course, there's one more screw to take out. So once you pull off this sticker in the back, this screw is super easy to get to. You unscrew it, and finally we are done with all the screws on this keyboard. So when you open the case, you want to be a little careful. There are some wires attached from the case to the PCB, and you definitely don't want to be ripping them off. There's one connector, that's for the USB. This one, I just kind of played with it a little bit, pushed it back and forth. What I did there was grab the wires. Do not pull at the wires when you try to pull this thing out. You want to grab at the actual plastic connector. So that's what I'm grabbing at. So make sure when you try to take this out, you grab the plastic connector. What I did here was use my screwdriver to kind of push it down a little bit to maybe help nudge it out, but this really isn't even necessary. I think I just needed to apply a little bit more force and it would have come out very easy. There's no latch or anything to this connector. But there we go, comes out super easy. And the next wire is even easier. This is actually connected to the battery, and this is the battery, you can see it in this shot, that gives you wireless. So this battery automatically charges when you plug the USB into this keyboard, and that's why you see that red LED on the spacebar sometimes. It's just to show you that it's charging. So now you can just pull the case away and we can finally get to the plate. This plate definitely feels like it's actually metal. I thought it was going to be something plastic, but no, when I hit it with my screwdriver bit, it sounded like metal. Definitely not very scientific, but this thing is definitely heavy and it definitely feels like metal, so that's always a plus. I'm now finally ready to start desoldering all the switches. I have a nice little solder station. You obviously are going to need a soldering iron to do this, and something to remove the solder. This right here is a solder sucker. You can buy for pretty cheap on Amazon, and as you'll see later, you can also use things like copper wick to remove solder. In this case, I use both. So this was my first time using a solder sucker. It took me a little bit of getting used to, and as you'll see right here on the first one, I kind of slipped when using it. I was also trying to give you guys a good angle to show how to use it. The way that I found best was, it doesn't really matter if you melt the plastic too much of the tip. The plastic is actually pretty thick, and I found that I was able to go through the entire desoldering process without ruining it too much. Now, it's better, I think, to come at the solder from a little bit more of a vertical angle, almost 90 degrees. I think that just tended to work better. And lastly, definitely wait till all the solder is melted and flowing. It may look like it's starting to flow, but a lot of these points, these solder joints, were pretty thick, and it took a couple seconds for them to fully melt and start flowing. And obviously if they're not fully flowing, then the solder sucker isn't going to do its job too well. So I was having a lot of problems with the solder sucker since it was obviously my first time. So I brought in my copper wick. So the copper wick works in a different way. The way it works is you want to put the copper wick on the solder joint, press your soldering iron on top of it, and wait till it heats up. And this way, when the solder starts flowing, it'll actually naturally flow onto the wick, and the wick sucks up the solder in that way. It may also help if you have some flux to get that whole process going and to get it melted. But if you're just patient with it, this copper wick method definitely does work. It's definitely a lot slower process though compared to the solder sucker. So after a lot of work, I was finally able to get one of the switches off. I just needed to make sure that the LEDs that came on the keyboard did not need to be desoldered for the switches to be taken off. Luckily that was the case, because this process would have taken way longer. Eventually I got everything off, and this was a long process. It was amazing to just finally get that last switch off of there. The whole time I had to use a combo of wick and first using the solder pump to remove the initial solder, and if there was anything left over, use some of the wick. Sometimes I would take a little solder, add a little extra, and then use the pump again. I'd always make sure that I didn't put on as much solder as I started with if I was going to try to do the double pump method. But sometimes that did work, and other times I had to just use the wick. Either way, we finally got the damn switch off. So there's one more screw that hides in the back of the PCB here. Once you take this screw, you can finally remove the plate from the PCB so we can get access to those stabilizers. These are plate mounted stabilizers, so they don't screw into the PCB. So they just have this latch that you just have to push on, and with enough force, the actual stabilizer will come off of the plate. I just use my hand there, and you can see it tilts up once you push in the little latch. I'm not even going to bother showing how to loop stabilizers. I'll just put a link in the description somewhere. I did a horrible job of recording this, and I just did not have a good enough camera setup to do that. So yeah, if you care, you can check out the link in the description, and there'll definitely be a better video there on how to lube these stabilizers. Once they're lubed, we just push them right back in to their slots on the plate. Make sure that the actual bar is in the right orientation. So the same way that you took them out, the way that the bar was facing up or down, make sure it's in that same way. We are now finally able to put our switches, our Kailh box blacks on the plate. So this is just super easy. The one thing you gotta watch out for is to make sure the hole on the switch that the LED is gonna shine through and where the LED will go, just make sure it's orienting the right direction. If you're unsure, just hold your plate up to your PCB, make sure the pins are in the right orientation, and make sure that the LED is actually over the right hole. Now that they're all on the plate, we just have to go back through, solder on every single switch, and we'll basically have a working keyboard. It's important that when you're soldering, not to add too much solder. You want it to almost look like a cone over your pin. You don't want it to get to the point where your solder is starting to look like a huge ball. So make sure less is always better. It's much harder to take away solder than it is to add it. So now we're finally done. And something else that I wanted to mention is that when you are putting on these switches onto the actual PCB, make sure that all the pins are aligned. Don't try to force it into the PCB. It should fall in there very easily. So you may have a couple pins on the switches that are bending a certain way, or maybe you even put in a switch wrong. So always double check. Try not to force anything. We are now finally on the home stretch. I have a bunch of foam laying in the background because I tried to add some foam to this case, but it didn't really work out. The foam was it was a little just too hard to add foam to the case with all the ridges and all the plastic inside, and I just decided to go against it. I didn't want to have to worry about cutting away lines for wiring and stuff like that. However, if you do find that your keyboard sounds a little bit too hollow, maybe when you hit a key too hard, you get a metal sound and it's like ringing, foam does help with that, and it'll definitely dampen the sound of your keyboard. So obviously before you put anything else on, plug in your USB cable, see if all the keys work, and here I'm just pulling up a nice keyboard tester, and I'm hitting every single switch to make sure that everything was soldered nicely and correctly. So finally, the last keycap goes on. We can plug our keyboard in and we can get to the sound test. So while my failed type racer goes on in the background, I wanted to talk about this build that I did for a little bit. Now, after everything is said and done, I definitely spent a lot of time on this build. And many people may be asking, was it all worth it? No, definitely not. I'm pretty sure most people probably won't even see this video. And even if they do, the very end thing that I got was a keyboard that was definitely better, but marginally better. And I'm not really sure if it was worth all the time I put into it. Obviously, I went from Otemu browns to Kailh box blacks. Now, that within itself is a nice upgrade. These switches definitely feel way higher quality, way less wobble, way smoother. But I put nearly 7 hours, maybe more, into just building this keyboard. I think if I spent maybe around 3 hours doing this, then I would possibly get the return that I'm going to probably see from these switches. You know, they do sound slightly better, they feel slightly better. But just desoldering the switches alone took 3 hours. We can luckily see on my watch that I started at 11:56 and I did not finish desoldering until 3:22 a.m. So obviously desoldering was a super long process. If I was just building this keyboard, these switches would be great, and I'm sure that I would think this whole process was worth it because I would have saved a lot of time. And you may be asking, well, why didn't you just get better switches? If you knew the process was going to be so long, why not upgrade to something a little bit better? Well, friends, that's because I got some exciting things coming up later this summer.